You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Steve Turnbull.
Thanks for tuning into Author Stories. We've got a great show lined up for you today. Be sure to go to hankgarner.com and subscribe to the show. No matter how you listen, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Pandora, Spotify, or YouTube, you can subscribe to the show and never miss an episode. I'd like to thank some sponsors today. Scribophile is a respectful online writing workshop and writers community. Writers of all skill levels join to improve each other's work with thoughtful critiques and by sharing their writing experiences. We're the writing group to join if you want to find beta readers, get the best feedback around, learn how to get published, and be a part of the friendliest and most successful writing workshop online. Improve your writing by receiving detailed critiques. Learn from a vast collection of free writing resources. Make lifelong friends in our busy community of writers. Writing is a solitary art, but that doesn't mean you have to be lonely. Lucky for you, there are thousands of writers on Scribophile every day, and we're a really friendly bunch. You've never seen a writing group like this one? Join Scribophile today at scribophile.community. For the Words is a unique writing motivator unlike anything I've seen. For the Words is an online writing platform which motivates writers of all backgrounds to increase their word count through gamification. Writing can be challenging, especially when you need to consistently produce a high output of words. By injecting a little fun into the routine and using daily rewards to promote a healthy writing habit, For the Words makes it easier to reach that word count. We're a community of bloggers, professional authors, college and high school students, research scientists, gamers, and first-time writers from all over the world. Come for the words, stay for the fun. Go to that's the number 4, thewords.com. Both Sides of the Law, the Casper Halliday NYPD series, Book 1 by Nathan Roden. He shared his father's dream of becoming a detective. A prison sentence was not part of his plan. Casper Halliday's dream began to unravel 2 months before his 16th birthday. His father, Bobby, resigned from the NYPD after 15 years without an explanation. Casper's parents fought. Sirens closed in on their home from every direction. The sound that had always been a source of comfort now brought only humiliation. Bobby Halliday moved out. Casper's dream dissolved into a daily fight for survival. All he wanted now was to finish high school so he could ease his mother's burden. On his 17th birthday, in the throes of depression, Casper made a bad decision. That decision brought him face to face with one of the most dangerous men in the city. In Casper's world, there is laughter and there are tears. There's light and there's bitter darkness. There are improbable friends and unspeakable enemies. The Casper Halliday NYPD series launches with the most unlikely of beginnings. Read Both Sides of the Law today. The ebook edition includes a sneak peek of Ghost Man, Book 2 in the series. Writers, the internet is one of the best tools for research and creativity. It can also be one of the biggest hindrances to productivity, distracting you from doing the seat-in-the-chair, hand-on-keyboard work. Rescue Time gives you an accurate picture of how you spend your time to help you become more productive every single day. Spot inefficiencies in your day and become better at managing your time. Create a goal like spending less than 1 hour per day on email to help you stay focused. Set an alarm to tell you when you spent more than 2 hours on Facebook. Try Rescue Time and use our special discount code for 30% off a Rescue Time premium account by going to rescuetime.com/authorstories. Let us help you rescue your time. The Sam Darling Cozy Set of 6, a box set of the Sam Darling Mystery Series. You can't beat the deal on this huge box set of 6 complete cozy mystery books, 800 pages, all in one for a low, low price. Follow Samantha Darling, her dog Clancy, and her beloved George through the first 6 books in Geraldine Dufresne's best-selling cozy mystery series. Between her big family of 5 siblings, her charming hometown of Quincy, and a sudden run of murders, Sam has her own work cut out for her. No one asked her to investigate, but that has never stopped her before. Includes book number 1, Who Killed My Boss? Number 2, Any Meat in That Soup? Number 3, Can You Picture This? Number 4, Will You Marry Me? Number 5, Where is Henderson? And number 6, Who's the Rogue? Read the entire series, with a new one coming out this fall. The Sam Darling Mystery Series by Geraldine Dufresne. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today I'm really excited to have Steve Turnbull on the show with me today. Steve is one of the best science fiction, fantasy, steampunk authors that I know, and I'm excited to have him on the show to talk all about writing fantastical stories. Welcome to the show, Steve.
Thanks very much, Hank. Hello. After that introduction, I don't think I'm going to get out of this room. My head's too big.
We'll just put a little butter on the sides. It'll be fine. It'll be fine. Steve, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
How much time have we got? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I was 15. Now, I know that sounds like I know lots of people say, oh, I've always wanted to write. I've always told stories, but not writing them. I either told them to myself or drew pictures or whatever. Anyway, I was... This is an old story. It's an old story because I'm old. I was at school, and I was in the maths class, and I was really good at it. So I was bored, and there was this book that somebody had left behind, and it was Cider with Rosie by Laurie Lee. Now, the full version of this story is that there had been a TV adaptation by the BBC of Cider with Rosie, and I'd seen it, and it had some implied physical relationships between a young man and a young woman. I know, absolutely. That's the whole Cider with Rosie thing. So I thought, okay, so maybe it's got something interesting in it. So I read it, except I got past the first page and went, oh my God, this is the most incredible thing I have ever read. I mean, up to that time, I read every single science fiction and fantasy book in the library. You know, I'd be going around looking for the yellow Golance covers because that was the science fiction and fantasy. So I'd read all that, and then Cider with Rosie, and it's an autobiography by Laurie Lee, who's a poet, and I read it, and I just couldn't believe how beautiful it was. So then I wrote 2 novels, one after the other, 50,000 words each, typing them out in the evening on an electric typewriter with a carbon paper because I knew I was going to need 2 copies. And that was, so those were the first 2 I read. I actually still have a copy of the first one, bearing in mind that this was, he said, counting on his fingers, 45 years ago. It was, it's terrible.
well, of course, that was, it's one of those, learner novels that we all have stacks of sitting around. I'm not saying they're covering my desk, but, I do find it intriguing that you were a science fiction fantasy fan and had read all of those, and then this story that is completely not that captured your imagination. And it's kind of one of the reasons that we have a very diverse cast of guests on this show, because I think we can learn so much from each other and from other genres, and when we just completely immerse ourselves in one thing, I think we're missing a lot of aspects of storytelling. How do you feel like that experience with that book change the way you maybe see stories, or did it give you some insight that you feel like opened a door for you?
Well, the insight it gave me was simply that I didn't realize before how beautiful words could be, because everything else had been very not run of the mill, because obviously the writers I was reading were good and they were telling a great story, but it wasn't necessarily beautiful. Now, I'm not saying I do that either. I'm not sure I necessarily write beautiful, but it just gave me a kickstart. But you're absolutely right about reading different things. I mean, whilst I have focused primarily on science fiction and fantasy even since then, I've read a fair chunk of romance. I like a good romance story, because storytelling is storytelling. And I sort of, over the years, I've come up with this theory, which is that we're in the business of hope. And perhaps we need it more now than we've ever done before. But we're here for people to read. I mean, people call it escape, but I'm not so sure it truly is escape. I think it's people seeing that you can win. And that's important.
Well, yeah, escape has a very negative connotation, that you're burying your head in the sand. You want to ignore the world. And I'm like you. I think great stories give you hope and show that we can face things head on. Not that we're avoiding them, but it provides courage in a way. Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's a quote which is often attributed to Neil Gaiman, who is awesome, of course. But it was actually G.K. Chesterton who said it first, which is dragons. the one about dragons. Yes.
Yes, I love it. Yeah, no, go ahead and read the quote if you.
I haven't got it in front of me, but essentially he was saying, that fairy tales are not important because they tell you that dragons exist. They're important because they tell you dragons can be beaten.
Right. Exactly. What did you pursue as a career? Because we all know that writers rarely leave school and go into the world and chase down stories. Most of our journeys to being a writer is circuitous. What did you decide to pursue in the beginning?
Well, I was always interested in technology and computers. I was at my first what we call secondary school in the UK. It's about a year 7, 8 equivalent. They didn't have those back then for me. I was 11. There was one of the first schools that actually had a computer link to a mainframe, and I just loved it. Programming was the thing I wanted to do. I always wanted to do it. I even nearly got expelled from school for missing classes because I was busy programming computers. There were stern words, I can tell you. Anyway, so after that, I went to university and studied computer science, which in those days was a very thorough course. And then I went into programming directly out of school. And then I turned left. And so I actually got a call from a publishing company, a magazine publishing company, who said, "Hey, Steve, do you want to come and work for us?" So I needed a job at that point. So I said, yes, please. So I became an editorial assistant on computer magazines, and then I became an editor. And for 20 years or so, I was editing computer magazines, writing articles, editing other people's articles. Towards the end, because the magazine had shrunk, I was actually doing everything. I was doing the layout. I was selling the advertising. I was good at that. This is not to say I enjoyed it, but I was really good at it. And the trick with selling advertising, by the way, is to not lie. and it,
Right.
because then you can live with yourself.
Right. Exactly.
So that went on, and then I got into a business situation which wasn't very pleasant for me. So I had 6 years of not being happy, and then I just got out of it and spent a year not doing anything, and then went back to programming again. Wow. Which is I've been doing since.
I have a similar story to yours. I'm a few years younger than you, but not a great deal. But I was a kid in the 70s, and I remember the personal computer revolution, and when things had come home with the TI computers and Apple and Commodore and the whole string, and loved programming as well. And I was that kid that would go missing, and I was playing with the computers in the corner. I've noticed there's a great cross section of people that are technology enthusiasts and that have worked in IT and things like that, and creative people, creative writers especially, and that surprises a lot of people because they think of computer programming as a very analytical thing, and they think of creative writing as the complete opposite. But I definitely see a connection there. Do you see the connection, and do you feel like your time working in technology fed your creativity, or still does, or do you not see any connection at all?
I know what you mean.
It's so difficult to put in words, but it's clunky.
I mean, yes, you're quite right. I mean, but the thing is, what people don't realize is that programming is creative. And there is an aesthetic to code. Yeah, I mean, sure, you can throw down a bit of code that does the job, or you can throw down a bit of code that looks really good and does its job beautifully. As long as it does do the job, that's fine. If it doesn't do the job, it doesn't matter how beautiful it is.
Right.
And yes, nobody's going to see it, except maybe some other developer sometime in the future who's going to look at it and go, how the hell does that work? But it doesn't matter, because to you as the creator of that code, you know what it's like, and you know it's beautiful. Or okay, satisfactory. Sometimes you have to hack. That's not so good, but it happens. But yeah, it is a creative endeavor, just like writing. Yeah, it's a different skill set in some respects. Problem solving is what you need, though, when you're writing stories.
Exactly.
It's a thing you do need.
Yeah, in some of those dark plotting days, a little problem solving comes in handy.
Well, I've done screenwriting as well, and I can't remember exactly who said it, but it's a case of, if you're writing action stuff, and I do love writing action. I mean, I write other stuff as well, but action's great. And you just throw your protagonists and whoever they're with into a situation which is impossible to get out of, and then you figure out how they can get out of it. I mean, I have a series. One of my steampunk series is the Iron Pegasus, which is two sisters and their ornithopter, set in East Africa, and they're forever getting into trouble and getting into situations, and I just love throwing them into situations that I don't know. When I write it, I have no idea how they're going to get out of it. So either I figure it out on the fly, or I'll go away and think about it for a little bit. But yeah, I love doing that. Problem solving is the thing. It is a common factor.
What about your work in journalism and editing, but you were also writing pieces? How do you feel like your fiction writing has benefited from that time working in that medium?
Oh, this is where things get a little bit awkward. You see, because you know Heinlein's rules. you write something once, you don't edit it, you don't revise it. Well, you might edit it just to polish it up a bit, but you don't revise it, and you just send it out. Well, those guys, they knew what they were doing, and they could create a story on the fly, and it would be right first time. And I don't know how much is down to my experience as a journalist. I don't know how much is down to anything else, but unfortunately, I'm one of those people. I can, as a pantser, I do planning in some situations, but as a pantser, I can and have just written a 105,000 word story. Actually, I won't talk about that one. There's a previous one. So the Dragons book was essentially was not planned, and that's 480,000 words.
Wow. And that's the Dragons of Esterness, the new box set.
Yeah. It's not revised. I didn't need to revise it because I feel very embarrassed because I know how much people sweat over their words. And I don't like to talk about it. It's online. People say, "Oh, what about doing revisions?" And I'm on my 50th revision of this. Well, that's a bit too much, but 10th revision of this. And I sit back and I say, I can't say anything. I cannot help this person because I don't know what that's like. And there's no point in me sitting here saying, "Well, I just write it right first time, so okay," because that just sounds like boasting. Or they assume that I'm a crap writer.
Well, that's not the case.
No. That is actually another thing that I've got from the editing and the journalism stuff, is that I know I'm a competent writer. I don't have any doubts about that. I don't consider myself to be, a fantastic writer, but I can get it down there. I can make readers cry. I can make them laugh. I can make them sit on the edge of their seats going, "How the hell, what's going to happen?" And that's it.
When did the tide turn for you and you began to pursue fiction again?
That was, so I mentioned I'd gone into screenwriting, because this was before the self-publishing revolution. And it was clear to me that having spent years sending out queries on a fantasy book and having one person wanting to read the whole thing and then saying no thanks, and having one reply that took 18 months to come back, it seemed to me that this was not an efficient way of making money out of writing. So I looked around and went, okay, screenwriting, that looks good. There's jobs in that. Most of the jobs in screenwriting have absolutely nothing to do with writing big blockbuster stuff. It's all to do with rewriting and being given an idea by a producer and working on that. Anyway, so I decided to go into that. I read some stuff. I actually got a paying gig at one point. I have received money for being a screenwriter. It was the film was never produced, but that's not unusual either.
Right. That's the rule, not the exception.
That's right. I mean, people have very, very, what most people think about screenwriting it just isn't true. It just isn't. It's a job at work. A screenwriter is the lowest of the low in the film industry. They're the least important person as far as the rest of the industry is concerned. I know it is crazy because, no script, no film. But that's the way it goes. Anyway, so I got into that and I was working on it, learning the trade, so on. And I'd written a couple of scripts, and then a friend of mine, who became a friend of mine, got in touch and said, "Look, I've read your scripts and I think they're actually pretty good. And would you like to do some bits? We could extract some scenes from a script and we could just produce them." So I thought, well, that sounds like a great idea. And believe me, there is nothing more wonderful than being in the room where actors are saying your words. I mean, the filmmaking process is incredibly boring, but those few moments when that's happening is just it's thrilling. Anyway, so that happened, and that was interesting, and we got on, so we were happy to carry on our collaboration. So he said, well, we could do a web series. So I wrote a thing for a web series. He said, yeah, but maybe this could be steampunk. And I said, what's that? So I got the lowdown and went, oh, yeah, cool. No, I can do that, easy. So I wrote a web series that was steampunk based. It's never been produced. We have a couple of extracts that we've done of that as well. But this is actually answering your question about the writing. But essentially what happened, by the time we'd got through all that, we'd got to the stage where Amazon had started doing the self-publishing thing. And I thought, well, okay, so, we had a Kickstarter that failed miserably. It was one of those, let's everybody laugh at these guys because they wanted so much and made so little. So I thought, okay, well, maybe I could get into the self-publishing lark, build up an audience by writing steampunk, and then ask that audience to give us money. That seemed like a reasonable solution. So I started writing steampunk murder mysteries, which became my Millia Anderson series, which turned from murder mysteries into crime thrillers, and is my flagship series, if you like. I mean, the series is finished now. And I wrote a prequel which was needed because I kept all through the books I've been referring to this event that occurred before the first book, and so I thought I'd better write that. That was an adventure. Anyway, so I wrote that. But that series is now finished, that's it. I mean, that was I first published in November 2013, I think, December 2013, and I've been writing books ever since.
Well, in hearing your story, Steve, one thing that I've noticed is that you seem to place yourself in a position to be able to say yes to things. And I love hearing people's stories because everyone has these weird circuitous routes that if you were to sit down and plan out ahead of time how you would get to the place you are now, no one would ever do it because it's just too crazy. No one can ever predict, how we get there. But there's something about being willing and open that when opportunities come along, that you can say yes. Is that something that you think about?
I don't think about it. No. I just do stuff, or not, depending on how I'm feeling. So people. It's like the rules. I'm doing air quotes here, of writing. Like you've got to write every day. Well, I don't write every day. I try to, but I don't beat myself up if I don't. And you must always do this, must always. I take no notice of that stuff. There is one rule that is actually a rule that when it comes to all art, and that's don't be boring. So as long as I'm not being boring, then I'm happy. But no, I don't think about saying yes or anything like that. I mean, I do say yes a lot if I can fit something in. There was the Dragons of Esterness. The first book was actually for an anthology that hit the USA Today bestseller list. So I can be a USA Today bestseller. That was quite calculated. I mean, I don't push it heavily. It's just on the covers, but then I wrote the rest of the books, so that's cool. I do podcasts when somebody comes along and says, "Hey, Steve, do you want to do a podcast?" Like you, strangers,
right?
I mean, so go on.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you about steampunk, and coming from a background where you were not familiar with the genre and its individual tropes and that to writing this amazing series that so many people love, what is it about steampunk that endears us to the genre?
Well, I can't speak for anybody else. I can only speak for me. And you see, the core of all story is conflict. There are lots of things that screenwriting technology, if you want to call it that, screenwriting rules can teach novel writers. Although the hero's journey isn't one of them, in my opinion. But the understanding that there has to be conflict in everything, otherwise you're boring. It's important. And the thing about, I write very historically accurate steampunk. I don't have weird magic. I don't have supernatural stuff. It's very, very real, apart from the ability to do partial anti-gravity. And even then, it's only partial anti-gravity. That's just the scientist in me. Because having partial anti-gravity, you've still got a barrier, so it's still conflict. Even just flying, whilst it's easier, it's still hard. There's still difficulties to overcome. So even in the technology, there's conflict. But what I'm interested in is the social conflict, because it's so much easier to write about important themes that exist today in a setting which has the same thing to the nth degree. You think that racism is bad now, and trust me, it is bad now, but then it was 100 times worse, and there was no getting away from it. You think that sexism is bad now, it is bad, but back then it was 1,000 times worse. So I have a female lead character who is also half Indian, half British. So she has a hell of a time being an investigator because she doesn't fit anywhere. And that's what matters, because it's representation, it's telling stories that need to be told. It's not that it's not that I preach, obviously, because that's boring. But it's there. It's in the story. The story itself, I hope, is interesting.
Well, and that's a great point that you brought up about not preaching. That being able to tell a story that has some resonance to our real world now, without hitting people over the head with it. Does it come down to not be boring? Is that how you pull that off?
I don't know. I just put it there. There's a thing that was always I love history, but my wife knows far more about it than I do. So I always use her as my consultant. Now, the Anglo-Indians were a specific group in India and in the UK, but mostly India. But there was a saying which was that they were too British for the Indians and too Indian for the British. So I've lost track of the question. I'm sure that was going somewhere.
Yeah, we're just talking about balancing having a meaningful story without preaching.
Yeah, yes. So given that she's dealing with the British in India and also dealing with Indians in India, you have the reactions of those people to her. So it's all natural, but you could say it's not even making a point, but I do make that point, and I've used that phrase that I just gave you in the story, to show that, but in a natural place, obviously.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, you could almost say
So
it's educational.
so
Oh God.
we could shine a light on the reality, the truth of something, and that is educating without offering commentary necessarily on it. We're just showing what the reality was, and with our modern sensibilities, that kind of jumps out, and we realize what they're dealing with.
Yeah, I mean that's it. I mean, there's a romantic theme that goes through it. I mean, she's actually not really that interested, at least initially, because she doesn't believe that the guy who fancies her is being honest with himself. Because how could that possibly be? And that would be a real reaction for somebody at that time in that position, because white people don't have a very good record, generally speaking, when it comes to other people, other races.
Yeah, we're not great when it comes to that. Generally, we can tend to go to the basest of our nature.
Yeah.
From the steampunk series, and we mentioned it earlier, the Dragons of Esterness series. What was the motivation to switch to more epic fantasy and change the landscape?
Money.
I'd love an honest answer.
Well, you'll get it from me. No, I mean, the Dragons of Esterness is I can't even say it myself. The Dragons of Esterness is set in a fantasy world, which actually my first real publishable book I wrote, which was called Eleanor, is set in the same world. I wrote that in the 90s. That's the one I was trying to get published in the normal way. So it wasn't totally out of the blue, but I had to look at the fact that, much as I have received critical acclaim for my steampunk books, when I say critical acclaim, the only critics that matter are the readers, and they love the books. I get very good ratings and reviews and such like, but I'm not making any money, and advertising just won't push it, because the Malia Anderson series, if I push it as crime fiction, it sells. If I push it as steampunk, it doesn't sell. So I have to be practical. I'm not getting any younger, and I would rather be writing full time than not. So I say that I wrote the Dragons for money because dragons always sell, and quite honestly, they're really selling. But that doesn't mean I didn't care. And you can't write an honest book unless you really mean it, and I really meant it. I mean, the main character is a POC slave. Oh, me going into those areas, naughty me. How dare I? But again, it's things that are important. So I wrote this story, and it sells. So there'll be more of those.
Right. What are it? And I completely agree with everything that you said. And you absolutely can make a living as a writer and be intentional about serving a particular market, but also not compromising yourself as a storyteller. I think that's a hard thing for some people to reconcile for some reason. They feel like you can't be true to your art form and intend to make money. I think they're perfectly fine if you accidentally make money, but if you intend to make money, there's just something warped about it. And I don't know where that mindset comes from.
No, I don't understand it either. I have got so many stories that I could be telling, and I am limited by the amount of time I have to do it.
Exactly. why do you think it is that dragons are such a force in fantasy literature? Like there's just something about people love these kinds of stories. What is it, do you think?
I'll be honest, I have absolutely no idea. I don't know. Maybe it's the power. Maybe it's the wonderfulness of them. Maybe it's because they're so different. Maybe it's because people really like the idea of riding on a dragon.
Yeah, right.
I don't know.
So what's the story? Who is the character, and what do we? What's the world about?
Right, okay. This is actually really hard because one thing that I don't do is padding. So there's a very, very little that I can say that isn't a spoiler. Okay, so the main character is a young woman called Kantees, who her job is to look after a dragon. They're racing dragons. Also, yeah, I never do anything normally. My dragons have feathers. Because they're actually dinosaurs, but they're magic. It's okay.
Right. Well, and that's a great point. There are been numerous discoveries lately of dinosaurs with feathers, and I wonder if that's going to be changing the shape of fantasy to come.
I don't know, but again, it's the scientist in me. I can't help it. But this particular world, when I first created it back in the 90s, although it is a world which is made of magic, but this is, again, it's science. This is my science. It's the smallest component part of all energy and matter and everything else in this universe is magic. So essentially everything is magic, but some things can do spells and some can do magical things, but not everything. And this world evolved. So it went through its whole dinosaur period, but they didn't die out. They just changed. So there are creatures that resemble Tyrannosaurus rexes in this world, although you don't get to see them much. But the magic is different too. I mean, I don't know that there's another fantasy story where the magic comes down to Earth from the twin moons in great, massive pillars of white light. That's so powerful that it can completely distorts the landscape and destroys things. And yeah, I really let my imagination run wild with this thing. I mean, normally I like to just change as little as possible between us and the real world, but with this fantasy universe, I just went crazy. But everything's consistent because that's the scientist in me. I know I've been saying this. I know I say that a lot. But in this world, individual types of animals might have developed a particular magical trait, which is part of their behavior, part of the way they are. For example, if you take imagine a cabbage. Now blow it up to the size of a house, except it's hollow on the inside and has a lifting gas so it can take off, and that it flies around in packs because it's not intelligent. I mean, it's for God's sake, it's a plant.
Right.
But in the daytime, the sun gets on it and it just lifts into the air, takes its roots out of the ground and lifts into the air and flies off with all the rest of them. It propels itself using the lifting gas, which it triggers to make fire. So it's actually jet powered. So, this is just one thing. Actually, they're a pest. Because the big one, mostly you don't have the really big ones. Mostly they're sort of like, the size of a chair. And if you get 100 or 1,000 of those landing in your fields, you're in trouble.
Yes.
So everybody has to get out there and kill them and rip them to pieces and burn them so that in the morning they don't take off and burn your crops. So, so everything, I try to think of everything. I'm sure I don't. But anyway, sorry, but the story of Kantees, yeah, so this is an island, the island of Esterness, and they have racing dragons, and she looks after one, but then something happens and she has to run away. She doesn't want to run away. I mean, she doesn't like being a slave, obviously, but her life is actually not that bad compared to some. So that's when the story starts, and I just cannot say anything else.
I love magical systems where magic costs something, and I love the idea of the magic coming in a destructive way, in some sense, down to earth, and it costs something. It imbues the world with this thing, but it also can be destructive and can when you're thinking of magic systems, are there certain rules that you try to go by, or do you just let your imagination go wild?
Oh no, I'm a scientist.
Of course you're a scientist.
No, I mean I've been playing tabletop role playing games, not just Dungeons and Dragons, but all of them. I don't know one I haven't played, so different sorts of magic systems are very, very, and rules for those things are very, very familiar to me. So I do have rules, but I'm not as rigid about. I don't necessarily explain them. I know whether something could work in my head, but I won't necessarily say that out loud.
Gotcha. Steve, if people are just learning about you and want to find out more and dig into your back catalog and all of that good stuff, is there a place where they can connect with you online?
Well, I am on Twitter quite a lot. It's becoming my preferred place. Once I've blocked out a lot of things, it stops being horrible.
It's kind of a dumpster fire sometimes.
It can be, yes. But it was all getting too much for the last week, so I've been blocking everything. Anyway, so on Twitter as this, I have a handle which it's completely unique across the entire internet, and if it's searched for, you will find only me. But the fact is, if people search Steve Turnbull on Google, I should be the person who comes up top first. So that's a good starting place. But my handle, which you can search for, it's A Dad Insane. Now, I'm a bit of a Bowie fan, and he had an album and a character called Aladdin Sane.
Yes.
And I swapped the L for a D. So I am a dad insane.
Aren't we all?
Yeah. It's so funny.
It is. It's hilarious.
Yes. So it's ADADD, then insane. So that's me. So that's me on Twitter. I'm also Steve Turnbull Writer on Facebook. I don't blog because, this is one thing I've just never really got into. But I have my personal website, which is steveturnbull.me. But that's not as good as my business website, which is taupress.com. And the Tau is TAU. Then press, no spaces or hyphens or anything. So taupress.com. And that one actually lists all the books, and it's got a fancy filtering system, so you can select, all the books about all the fantasy books or all the steampunk books. I'm having fun with that website because I'm a web developer.
I love it. Well, Steve, we're going to send everybody to see you. I'll link all of those ways that they can connect with you in the show notes, and as well as link to the books where people can buy your work, because that's what we want people to do. Steve, it's been so much fun chatting with you. We're going to send everybody to see you. Thanks for taking time to come on the show.
Well, thank you, Hank. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to the Author Stories podcast. Be sure to subscribe at hankgarner.com or on your favorite podcasting app. Now stay tuned for an audiobook excerpt from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series.
He led Jason to a small bistro. The door set tiny bells to chime as they entered. The place shivered with smells. Coffee, hot chocolate, and croissants. "This," he said, extending his arm towards a woman in an apron, "is Jennifer. She makes the best scones and is tragically spoken for." He kissed the woman's hand. She was plump, in her 50s. She had left one curler to dangle at the back of her head this morning. "If it's a tragedy to you, this is the first I've heard of it." She swatted at him with a menu. "Why didn't you speak up 20 years ago, lady killer?" Jason sat. Jennifer put a glass of water in front of him. "And who is this fine gentleman?" "This," said Hedwig, joining, "is my son's great-grandfather's great-great-nephew." "That's a lot of greats. Any great-great-great-whatever of Hedwig is great by me." She giggled at her own wit. "I'll be back for your orders." Hedwig swatted her rear end with a menu as she left. He made small talk about the bistro, the specials, what was good, the Benedict, or not so, the hanger steak. When their orders came, coffee for both, eggs for Jason, a scone for himself, he got down to business. "I met your grandmother about, a year ago. Valerie and I have a mutual interest in old families, particularly old families related to the legend for obvious reasons. Valerie's lived in Tarrytown for years, though her family's up near Boston. Now don't worry, I don't believe all that nonsense about a headless horseman. Valerie's the superstitious one. But the Van Brunts are definitely the family in Irving's story. Hermanus Van Brunt and his wife Agatha were farmers in the village back in 1780 or so. This was during the Revolution. Hermanus grabbed title to lands left by a Tory family who'd been tarred and feathered and shipped back to Britain. Do you know your history? Sure, Tory, loyal to the king. Benjamin Franklin broke with his own son who was a Tory. Smart boy. Traitors to the cause, and that was serious business. The British marched straight through here during the war, chased George Washington off Manhattan and out to New Jersey. And after they were kicked out again, a lot of Tories were kicked out with them. Anyway, the Van Brunts took over some farmland north of Tarrytown. They had a son, Abraham. And, of course, their son Abraham married a wealthy heiress. Katrina Van Tassel. Yes, all that is true. It's public record, just like the legend says. My mother left behind quite a few documents written by Abraham Van Brunt, Brom, in Dutch mostly. He was powerful around here. With Katrina's money, he became the biggest stone merchant in the state. He died in 1850. After him, it's Dylan Van Brunt, his son Joseph, the grandson, then Cornelius, then... Sorry, genealogy is not my thing. No? Why was Eliza doing research on the Van Brunts? She wasn't. She was looking into the Cranes. That's what made us such fast friends. I don't get it. We do go back a ways, your family and mine. More coffee? Jennifer appeared at Jason's elbow. Hedwig nodded and she poured. Still not getting it, said Jason. But he did. Hedwig turned to the waitress, and Jason knew what he would say. My lady, may I present? He raised his coffee cup, proclaiming, the last descendant of Ichabod Crane.